and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Real quick, guys, I want to sincerely thank all of you who have left us a 5-star review on the podcast. Every time you leave a review, we spread awareness about PDA and help families with PDA kids and teens find stability and hope. Now let's get on with the episode. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. We have our frequent flyer guest here, which is Dr. Alex Klein. He is a clinical psychologist in California, and he specializes in working with families with PDA and neurodivergent children. So we love having him on to get the clinical perspective, also the lived experience perspective, because he's a parent and an ADHDer himself. So he is the full picture, or whatever you call it. He's the whole deal. And we're super happy to have him. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much, Casey, for having me on again. I love our conversation, so I'm excited to be here.
Yes, I'm excited that you're here. So last night, you and I were emailing, or you emailed me, and we were trying to think of ideas for the topic today, which is, what do we think are the top 5 misconceptions that people have about pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy? So I was home with the boys last night, my 2 kids, 11 and 7, both PDA. And I was trying to think about this and was getting incessantly interrupted. And so I leaned into the moment and said, hey guys, this is what I'm doing. What do you think? So I have some misconceptions to share that are from the mouths of babes, my kids. And Alex has his 5. And I think what we're going to do is go back and forth and have a conversation about each one.
Love it.
So, would you like to start us off with your first misconception?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there's so many here. When I was trying to think of these, I found that I was just like listing tons and tons. And then I realized that a lot of them actually kind of relate to each other. And there's a lot of overlap. But the first one that kind of distilled down into one concept that I see as a really common misconception with PDAers and their families in particular is a really common presumption that the parent is doing something wrong, especially in the context where there are lower demands, the demands have been lowered, or the kid might not be, say, going to school. And I don't want to say this is everywhere, but I would say this is far too pervasive. And I think this sort of relates to, some other misconceptions that we see around how, this child just needs more pushing, or, the parents need to just place more boundaries on the kid, or the parents are being too permissive, right? There's sort of this like, I think oftentimes I do see a pretty quick assumption from, maybe schools or other clinicians or the medical teams that this is a kid that just needs to be pushed more. And so I think that kind of ties into stuff we've talked about, you and I, Casey, around, parent blame as being a big issue in the space. And, it's a really harmful misconception because I think it can, of course, make it harder to, for parents and families and the kids to feel understood, right? If you're sort of like being viewed as not doing it right, like parents are already quite stressed. I think it was a year and a half ago where, under the Biden administration, when the Surgeon General was saying that like parenting in and of itself is like a public health crisis right now. Like parents are really struggling. And then you have sort of parenting, neurodivergent kids and PDA kids, and there's like absolutely extra layers on top of that, right? But then when you kind of intersect with the system where, and parents might not, and of course this is not everybody that you're interacting with, and hopefully we're advocating to find the right people. But if it's sort of being met with like kind of an immediate assumption that they're doing something wrong, that is just going to feel terrible, right? It's like already layered on top of, some overwhelm and exhaustion. And so, I think that's a really, really common one, right? And, what I see time and time again, are parents who've done their kind of, maybe they followed the mainstream kind of parenting advice that has already been given to them, right? You've talked a lot about, doing your cost benefit analysis, Casey, right? About why you might not, force your kid to do their homework or go to, a sports practice or whatever it is, right? But again, there might be sort of an assumption, this misconception like, oh, well, if we can't just sort of reinforce their avoidance, like, we need to kind of push harder, which, as we know, does not always work. Maybe that works for some kids, right? But we're not talking about the majority of kids. We're talking about, a specific segment of the population here. And so that was probably the first one that came to mind as like a really common and also problematic misconception.
Yeah. So I think this is such a big one because I do think it is the knee-jerk reaction from even the most well-meaning school administrators, physicians, many, many therapists of like an immediate assumption that the parent is not pushing hard enough, that they're not making the kid do something, that they're creating or making worse this behavior, that they're permissive or enabling. And I think that it's so strong. I think it extends beyond the professional training of teachers, therapists, and doctors. I think it actually is a part of our culture.
Yeah.
Because parents themselves feel this misconception. Like, when your kid won't leave the house, for example, there is the misconception that I need to push them to leave the house to get fresh air. Or if they're not eating healthy food, I have to make them eat healthy food, right? And so like as parents, we're fighting against these assumptions. And we're trying to experiment with a different way based on PDA. And then we're already insecure about it. And then it's met with this next layer of like, well, you're doing it wrong. And then you question yourself again. So I think this is definitely a harmful misconception. And, for the parents listening, why don't we talk about why it's a misconception and not the appropriate assumption?
Yeah. Well, lots there, right? I mean, because I think, first of all, what might be viewed as permissive to others, parent being too permissive or, might actually be an attempt to let the child recover from burnout. Or maybe there is stuff that the kid is doing, but because they don't have capacity to do more, it's because it'll tie into another misconception later on. But because they don't have the capacity to do a lot of things, like maybe the things that might be more visible to others, like going to school, but they do have capacity for some things, and those things just might not be visible. And in fact, the disability itself, when it's not apparent to others, right, the way that like maybe if you were sort of had a child recovering from, God forbid, a cancer diagnosis, and they couldn't leave the house for a while because they're immunocompromised, right? Like that's met with a lot of empathy and understanding, like that kind of disability. But this kind of disability that's not apparent to others, people do not really start from a place of like empathy and understanding and tolerance, unfortunately. So I think it's like people aren't getting it, but really I think what might be going on is that we need to actually sort of like reset with a kid, right?
Yeah.
Like we might, and I think that the parents, not only, are they not necessarily doing something wrong, it's not to say that like we all as parents, we might still have areas of growth that we want to change in our parenting. But again, it's like framing the problem in terms of a parenting issue is really what I see. But I do really see that like sometimes, right, like what the parent actually is doing is actually quite radical. It's like rethinking what does it mean to be a good parent, like despite what the sort of, societal expectations are. And I see this as actually in a lot of cases as being more attuned to what the right level of challenge is for your child, right? So sometimes these things I think get sort of polarized as to like either you are going all out in kind of pushing all these things for your kid, or you're doing nothing, right? When like really, it's actually trying to kind of meet the kid where they're at and tuning into their abilities in the moment. And it's just that it's not necessarily seen that way to others.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's this assumption that it's so funny because I think if you sat down any of these individuals, you could say two opposing sentences and they'd agree with both, right? Mm-hmm. Like one is you should be able to have your child under control and make sure they do X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. But conversely, if you were talking on a more philosophical level and about what is unconditional love, it's accepting the other without needing them to change. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think like if I sat down with a psychologist and they didn't know I was in the PDA space, like I think many would agree with both of those things. But with a PDA child, those sometimes are in contradiction to one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Like I can't force my kid to do something because it's going to activate their nervous system and make them have a trauma response or push them further into burnout. And that's not unconditional love. That's me trying to control them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely agree with number one. And I think this ties into this whole notion, especially for parents who are raising neurodivergent kids who are less visibly neurodivergent, which is not PC, but like this is true. Like if you have a quote, if you have a kid who doesn't appear disabled, the assumption is always you caused this behavior, parent, rather than like, no, something's going on beneath the surface. They have different brain wiring. Their nervous system is sensitive. Their perception is different. Like the causality is always parent caused Y, and often mom caused Y.
Right, exactly.
Which has rippled throughout history in terms of a narrative, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Good misconception, but I don't like that it's true.
Yes, totally. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to do my first misconception. And this was, we were playing with a 3D printer last night. And, they were doing laps around the kitchen island because they're always in motion. And the first thing my 11-year-old PDA son said, he's also got an autism diagnosis, the first misconception is that they are a bad kid, which I think, especially if you have a kid who's going into fight or flight a lot, PDA or otherwise, you're going to see oppositional, defiant, avoidant behavior. And you might see like lashing out or screaming or kicking because you have a mammal that is subconsciously perceiving they're in danger or under life threat. But the assumption immediately goes to they're a bad kid, right? And so I thought it was pretty profound that was his first.
Yeah, it's profound. It's sad, but it's sort of great that he is, naming that as a misconception, right? He's sort of advocating against it as as an idea. And it's not shocking. I mean, because we know the sort of things that tend to be said about many neurodivergent kids, like, oh, they're being a brat, they're being manipulative, they know better, he's just being lazy, like they're being dramatic, I know, all these types of, right, all these types of messages. In fact, there's a study, I don't think we've talked about this, maybe we have, where, kids who've had an ADHD diagnosis, by the time they are 10 years old, they've received on an average of 20,000 more negative feedback messages than kids who do not have ADHD. Now, this is going to be relevant for many neurodivergent kids, not just ADHD, but it's like, of course, one might internalize the message that they're a bad kid, right? Because they're getting in trouble a lot, right? They're getting, negative comments, or they're getting judged maybe, or they're, So, it's sad. And I love that he's sort of like fighting against that. I'm not a bad kid, despite what everyone says here.
Yeah. And like, I'll be honest, I had this misconception until I learned about and understood PDA. And it was like, as a parent, I had to make a choice of like, am I going to continue with this path, which is like he's a bad kid and I need to condition him not to be, train him
Mm-hmm.
not to be,
Mm-hmm.
or can I hold the belief that he's already a good kid, that he exists as good? And I think about humans this way, actually,
Mm-hmm.
of like, there is a part of them that is unconditionally good and part of source that can never be corrupted. And my job is to support the conditions that will allow that to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And that might mean counter cultural or intuitive approaches. And
Right.
I now have the evidence, right, with both my children and with all the families we've worked with that, like, oh, when we bring down the threat response, there's like actually this wonderful, sensitive, loving child in there that's not violent at all, or even
Mm-hmm.
teens. But
Mm-hmm.
you have to make that decision because you might just be seeing the surface level really tough behavior,
Mm-hmm.
screaming, criticizing you, controlling you, not letting you do anything in the home, saying, it can be really hard to believe that they're a good kid when they reach these levels of aggression and fight flight behavior.
Right. Right.
So it's almost like you have to decide to believe that and then move from there with a different parenting approach before you can see the evidence sometimes. Or you have to look back to like when they were a baby or a toddler before burnout and remember, like they're just a child.
Right, right. Kind of seeing underneath all the sort of external the stress responses that manifest as, aggression and really, really hard issues. So, yeah, it's like what's sort of underneath all that, seeing your child's sort of inner goodness, right? And finding ways to connect around their passions and ways to lower their stress and, to see these other parts of your child are so important. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard though. It's hard as a parent, especially with an externalized PDAer, because they will not look like a good kid
Mm-hmm.
according to like how we measure it in society.
Mm-hmm. The psychologist Ross Greene, who wrote the book The Explosive Child, and I love, his approach. He talks about like sort of externalized behaviors as sort of unlucky because it tends to not, kind of elicit empathy from others in the way that like being kind of sad does, right? Or,
Yeah.
just like, I don't know, there's a way that like maybe sort of like externalized, sort of aggressive, stuff is like does not elicit the kind of empathy and understanding that kids need, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it's
Or the
like, how do we sort of
curiosity.
see underneath all that is so important.
Yeah, because you just want to make it stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that as a mom for sure.
Of course, of course.
But yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Okay. Misconception number 2.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is the misconception that, oh, well, my kid did it yesterday or the student did it yesterday. So therefore they can do it again today. They know how to do this. So they should be able to do it again now because they did it yesterday or whatever in the past. And I think this sort of links with this message that's a really common kind of parenting recommendation is that like you must be consistent. Like once you've sort of like set an expectation or made a demand of your kid, you must be consistent. And honestly, I think consistency is like quite overrated and like really leads to what I think would be too much inflexibility. Like when we meet kids who have difficulty being flexible and then we are also not being flexible, like that is not a good combination. And it doesn't mean that we never hold, let's say, like a consistent bedtime or something. Like maybe we've done our cost benefit analysis and like we've just decided that like even though it's hard, and it's going to get pushed back and it's not my kid's choice, like I'm still just kind of like keeping something consistent. So I'm not sort of suggesting in some kind of black and white way that there's never stuff that we do consistently. But I think it's just like we really hear this message a lot, right? And I think that this message of like, oh well, my kid did it yesterday, so he should be able to do it again today. doesn't take into account this concept of like fluctuating capacity, right? We
Yeah.
hear this talked about in the context of spoon theory. Spoon is sort of units of mental energy, and sort of how many spoons, how much capacity does your kid have? Like, maybe they went to school and, the kindergarten class had to, was like particularly chaotic and loud and the kid is drained. And so therefore, like they can't, go and get their cup of water or whatever because, they just don't have it. Or maybe, the kid isn't really, processing their own internal body cues or something of hunger. And so their capacity to manage frustration is lower right now because like they haven't been able to communicate that they're hungry. But again, it's like we don't necessarily see this is not always obvious, how capacity fluctuates. And so, this message, this misconception, like, oh, well, they've done it in the past, so they should do it again, is sort of an example of, kind of a mismatch maybe in the moment between our expectations of the kid and the kid's ability, right? And it's that mismatch, is when there's a lot of challenging behaviors might happen, right? So I do think it sort of speaks to the importance of really trying to meet kids where they are in the moment, right? Rather than sort of looking at what they were able to do last week or whatever. So anyway, that was another big one, I think, for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a tough one as a parent too, because you're like, especially if your child has gone into burnout.
Yeah.
Like, so my 7-year-old William, who's much more internalized. So, speaking of different levels of empathy and connection available depending on how the nervous system responds, William was never violent or aggressive. Right. So it was much easier for me to like stay in compassion as a parent. And he was my second, so I had been through it. But, he went through kindergarten and learned to read beautifully. And every night he would insist on reading, like doing the homework, which was totally optional. But he was, little did I know, he was trying to have the most amount of books that he got through in the entire class because there's that drive to be above, that, like in the PDA realm, to feel safe, right? So he was a great reader, and then he stopped not only reading, but being willing to like hold a book, look at a book, talk about a book, have us read a book. And for the last 8 months has not done the book thing, although he's been doing like Minecraft and lots of screen time and has been navigating learning to code and like figure stuff out on his own if he wants to like learn a game. But I had no idea like how much or even if he was retaining any of those quote skills that he had learned in reading. But when I would try, I would like, especially in the beginning, I was kind of trying to homeschool him and he just couldn't do it. He would sit down and I'd try and help him, but his body was in motion. He couldn't focus on the page. He would like avoid, resist, like kind of run from the room. And so it was very confusing because it's like, well, you were a great reader. Why can't you even like open a book and get through more than one page?
Right.
And now, like just this week, he's been like, I'm bored because he's coming off the screen. And my husband's like, well, do you want to play Sorry? Do you want to play a card game? Should we go on a walk with the dog? He's like coming out of burnout. He's like, no. And he's like, well, do you want to read a book? I could read it to you or you could read it to me. And this week he's been like, I'm going to read a book to you. So he's reading these books that like he hadn't even gotten to in terms of level now to us. But I had assumed like he didn't have the skill anymore.
Right.
But he just couldn't access it because he was so activated and so much in his survival brain that like he just couldn't do it.
Right. So at one point he was feeling this real pressure and drive to be, read the most books in his class. Right. But that I mean, among many other things, probably can contribute to burnout too, right?
Yeah.
And so, but then it sounds like he got to a place where he just like couldn't even go there, right?
Yeah.
It was either like, I'm going to be the best at this, I'm going to read the most books, or just like, whew, that is too much pressure. Those are too much on me. I need to just sort of really take a extended hiatus here. And then
Yeah.
he kind of came to it, without the pressure. But you could sort of imagine, right? If you're like, oh, well, like last month he was reading most days and or whatever it was, and now he's not. And then you're kind of in a battle with your kid, like that really might not work. I mean, oftentimes I think with a lot of kids I see, like it actually doesn't work, right? So like we might decide
Yeah.
to pick a battle, but it sounds like, eventually he kind of came to this on his own, which is sort of lovely, right? Like when he had a little
Yeah.
more capacity, maybe. Is that how you understand it? Like his sort of
Like he
burnout
just has
starts
like
to
a
come out of
window.
it a little bit.
He has a window of tolerance in his nervous
Hmm.
system. He has autonomy around it. And
Hmm.
I think he's just operating more from his rational brain these days.
Hmm.
So he can like access the
Right?
skills of learning.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a big one. This is a big one. Like even now, at this point, my 11-year-old like dresses himself, he ties his shoes, he carries his backpack, all the things. But we lowered those demands for years. Okay,
Right.
years.
Right. Right.
But there are still days, and I always know, like, okay, something's going on this week where he'll be like, Mama, can you tie my shoes for me? And he's 11. And like, if I was still in the old logic of like, he has to get used to tying his shoes, it would just lead to these power struggles, which it used to with him. Because I was still doing the traditional parenting thing of like, no, he has to learn. I have to consistently make him do the thing or else he'll never
Right.
learn, which
Right.
we know from PDA kids, it's not true.
Do you feel like sort of what factors lead to, okay, on this, even though the last, month he's been tying his own shoes, but today is different? Like, is that sort of predictable sometimes, or does it seem like it kind of comes out of nowhere and we don't always know? Because I think it can be really hard to
Yeah.
know,
I
where
mean,
that comes from.
I always will default to if a kid's asking for an accommodation, I'm trusting that they need it and I'm doing it with love.
Right.
Because I've learned over and over again the hard way that if I'm like, no, you can do this, and I push it, there's going to be a cost somewhere else, either to the relationship or to their regulation in the evening or their ability to sleep. Like it's not a costless
Yes.
interaction.
Exactly.
So when I see like more need cropping up, it's usually a cue for me to dig beneath the surface and try and understand what's going on at school. Of like, oh, there was testing this week, or oh,
Right.
they're talking about middle school applications to this other private school and he doesn't know if he's going to get in. But he doesn't share that with me. So I actually have to
Right.
use those moments as a data point to dig deeper in a moment of regulation, like right before bed, not
It's
in
like
the
stress
moment of the
detective
chew.
mode.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not when he's
Not in the moment.
I don't go, yeah, I'll tie your shoe, but what's going on at school? I'm just like,
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
bud. And then like
Right.
clock it like, oh, we should
Yeah.
probably use a little declarative sentence tonight.
Yeah. And then maybe later on, we're kind of in a very gentle, subtle way. We're in kind of stress detective mode, trying to find out a little bit about what's going on. Yeah,
Yeah.
today seemed harder. Something's there. Yeah, and it can be really hard. We can't always know, right? I think sometimes our kids just have no desire to talk about what happened at school. It's like,
Totally.
we have no desire to go back there in our minds, and so like we're not going to. But then we might find out eventually. Still,
Or I'll email the teacher.
Right,
I'll be like, did
exactly.
something
Yeah.
happen at school today?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I love that. The consistency thing and the fluctuating capacity. So from the parents and like the pressure to feel consistent, and from the observing your child, just like allowing for them to have fluctuating capacity, and that's okay.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. My second misconception, which isn't framed perfectly as a misconception because it's from Cooper, my older son,
I love
but
it.
I'm just going to tell you exactly what he said because I think it's great. they don't understand how much freedom we need. They don't understand that you need more freedom in order to start following the rules that seem harder. If you tell them not to do it, they will eventually have to start doing it. So I think this is a beautiful and paradoxical description of PDA itself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, feels very on the nose here. Yeah.
So it's like basically like that misconception that if you want them to follow the rules or the norms of the values of the home, you need to force them and explicitly teach them to do it on your timeline. But actually, the more autonomy or freedom and equality we give these kids, the more likely they are to actually eventually do the thing. So I felt that was very self-aware of him.
Yeah, I love that. It's like whose agenda, like I'm perceiving this agenda, like there's these rules that are being placed on me, that you can try to push these on me, but you don't understand how that's not going to work so well here.
Yeah.
Right? And that actually, I think I need more to kind of come to this on my own. Is that how you hear that? Right? Because I don't hear him saying, I'm never going to follow the rules. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying, like, if you kind of go about this in a certain way, it is not going to work. Right.
Yeah.
But here's some things that might actually work. And I love, and you said this before, this concept of trust, like trusting your kids. I mean, I take these kind of statements seriously, right? That's really something to work with because, there might be a reasonable rule that a teacher puts in place, right? That like maybe kind of makes sense, for the classroom or whatever, right? But it's like, how do we get the kid to sort of buy into it? How do we respond when they are having a difficulty, following that rule or expectation and kind of, but I love how he's saying this. This is a really brilliant here.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little microcosm of how PDA works. So, and it's funny because I think a lot of PDA kids are actually quite attuned to rules, especially as they apply to others.
Right, totally.
So it's not a lack of understanding. Like it's not like they don't get the rule or haven't processed the rule or even necessarily that they disagree with the rule. It's the perception of threat around the rule itself. So yeah, and that's when we see more accommodations and a window of tolerance, allowing them to sort of follow the norms and rules more easily than a really strict in the moment behavioral approach. And I can think of an example actually from school for him. Like they have a rule, which is, as you said, very reasonable. Like the kids of a certain age can't climb past a certain point on this one piece of playground equipment. So if they get higher than a certain rung, they're asked to come down because they could get hurt, right? And I think my son, I haven't heard much about it, but my assumption would be he always goes like 1 inch past and then gets told gently, hey, bud, remember, like, we got to stay below this rung because the teachers understand PDA.
Right.
And they're not in that mindset of like, he went 1 inch past and I have to show him who's boss. So I have to punish, right? It's just like, oh yeah, like, and it's not directed at him. It's a reminder to everybody. And he's always come down and it's been no big deal. Or he hasn't even gone in the first place. But there was an incident where they had a substitute teacher. Who didn't know.
Substitute teacher problem.
Substitute teacher.
New expectations, changes, doesn't understand PDA. This is such a common problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he, I'm sure, did the same thing he always does, which is like, I'm just going to go 1 inch past, or I'm going to like test out by going a little bit further. And instead of the like declarative statement and like the reminder to everyone, instead of directed at him, it was like, the substitute teacher like yelled at him, like, get down from there. And so what did he do? He climbed higher and refused to come down.
Right.
And so in that moment, he looks like this bad, defiant kid, but it's actually
Right.
his body not letting him climb down. I mean, this is what he's saying.
Right. This is
Like,
direct pressure, demand, harsh, not relationship, not indirect, not done to the whole group, not done in a subtle way.
yeah,
Right. It's going to
he's
have the
getting singled
opposite.
out and like he
Hmm.
froze and
Hmm.
couldn't come down and like was
Hmm.
saying no. And then there was more escalation. And so it's like the same exact behavior with a rule
Mm.
that is appropriate for everyone, but a different response from the teacher results in a very, very different outcome for a PDA kid.
Totally, totally. And these might not seem like a big deal to others, like school staff, right? But like I know families that when they know there's going to be a substitute teacher, because sometimes you know ahead of time, you don't always, they just like are either keeping their kid home from school literally
Yeah.
because they just like they know from experience that like this is not going to go well, or we're really trying to make extra sure that this new substitute teacher kind of understands the expectations or understands how to work with your child. But like this is a really common issue I see
Yeah,
for sure.
totally.
It
Okay.
also seems like a
Well,
bit of a like a I'm like so this is like playground equipment that like is fairly easy to climb to the top of, but the kids just aren't allowed to go past a certain point. Is that what it is?
yeah, I don't know if it's
Okay.
still there. This is when he was younger.
Yeah.
And
It
they've,
just seems like a little bit of a setup almost for like a lot of kids who might just be kind of impulsive, and just like climbing. I don't know. That's tough.
yeah,
That's a tough setup for
it
kids
is. It
there.
is a tough setup for neurodivergent kids, and especially for PDA kids who it's like,
Yeah.
don't touch this big red button. Who's going to touch
Right.
the big red button
Exactly.
first? It's the
Exactly.
PDA who's like,
Yes.
boom.
Right.
They're going to
Right.
do it without even, yeah, you'll have the ADHD or with the impulsiveness, and then you'll have the
Yeah.
PDA who's
Right.
like, the nervous system is just making them do it. They know
Hmm.
they shouldn't and they're realizing it, but it's like nervous
Mm,
system driven.
absolutely.
It's
Hmm.
tough. You're number three.
Oh yeah. My number three. Okay. So another kind of misconception I see is this idea that like, oh, well, accommodations, these accommodating my child won't prepare them for the real world. Right?
Yeah.
This is a
I hear this one
common
all the time.
thing I hear that I think comes from a place of fear, and a place of really wanting your child to do well. But I think that to me, it also kind of like some little alarm bells go off when I hear that a little bit, because it kind of implies that, well, like actually the problems, aren't located in society, but they're located in my child. So we talk about sort of a social versus a medical model of disability. In a medical model, it's like, oh no, the problem is located in your child who needs to be changed. Whereas a social model of disability, we need to make the world more inclusive and accessible and change the world essentially. And so, and the real world, quote unquote, like has all kinds of problems. So,
Yeah.
so I like to think more about like, well, how can we advocate for changes to make the world more accessible, right? Is sort of a different way to frame it. Like maybe we can raise kids who will change the world, right? To make
Yeah.
it a better place for all people. And to use a really concrete example in the sort of physical disability community. So like when, people with disabilities are advocating for better wheelchair access, curb cuts, like first of all, they were met with like a lot of like, oh, well, we don't want to make things too easy. That's just going to make people lazy, right? We're not going to add, ramps here, right? But then, they add some of these things and actually this makes it easier for people with strollers to roll, to get over the curb, or people carrying luggage or something, right? Like making the world more inclusive for one person is not just going to make the world more inclusive for that one person. But I do think that it's like, it's not so black and white. I mean, accommodations can help people access the world,
Yeah.
right? Rather than sort of make it so that they can't tolerate the quote unquote real world. So, I empathize the place where this comes from. I think parents fearing, like, what's my child going to do when I'm not around, or no one's there to, advocate for them and things like this, right? Deserves a lot of empathy. But I also think that, like, when we're using that framing to actually discourage the use of accommodations, that tends to not work. right? Like that is the pattern I see. So I think that's another important one, another important misconception to be aware of, that that kind of framing is not helpful for your child.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like to think, and I've learned this on a personal level, like we can change things. We can change ourselves. We can change our environment. We can change who we spend time with, where we put our money, our attention, our energy. And like, obviously, there are different levels of privilege on certain dimensions, like finances. But it's like a lot is at play. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
like just take all of these systems that do change generation after generation at face value, and we're just like, well, the real world doesn't operate like this. But it's like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
think that things actually change? It's because people on a micro level are making decisions,
Right.
you know, to do it differently, to live differently. And I also think what's unique about PDA and is distinct from perhaps a physical disability is that it's fluctuating, right?
Right.
And so accommodations paradoxically can actually make it more likely that your kid is independent and able to access things because you're not
Absolutely.
constantly pushing them into burnout or pushing them past their threshold of tolerance. You know, even if they're able to like get through grades at school, they might not be retaining any of the information. They're just like regurgitating it out of survival or
Mm-hmm.
complying out of survival
Mm-hmm.
versus a child who's like regulated, has a window of tolerance, they're operating from their thinking brain, and they can learn very quickly and retain it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what I've found with many of the families we work with once the kid
Yeah.
out of burnout, right? But I also think, you know, what would be the analogous situation to the ramp with PDA, right? Like,
Well, it's like if a wheelchair user, if there isn't a ramp, then they need like maybe someone to help them up a step, right? But then but with the ramp, they can do it independently,
yeah,
right?
great point.
I
Great
don't know
point.
if that's what you're getting at there.
So, what I was getting at is like, this is maybe a little bit too high level, meaning like too bird's eye view. That's what
Hmm.
I mean. Because a ramp is concrete and a curb is concrete. But like one of the things that I think accommodating a PDAer does is it makes you very aware of how much you're trying to control another
Hmm.
human and
Right.
how you're defaulting to these hierarchies of power,
Right.
right? And we have this assumption or misconception that like parents need to be in control and be the authority always.
Hmm.
But it plays out in broader society of like, it's appropriate to have all these levels of hierarchy and control for humans. But like the PDAers make us think about that differently. Like maybe there's a
I love
different,
that.
more collective, collaborative, egalitarian way of operating. And maybe that's not on like a national level at the US federal government, but like in my business, for example, it's like, well, I don't have to do it like a big corporation. Maybe I won't grow as much, but like I can operate with people who are neurodivergent, myself included, and still have a livelihood that's meaningful with this
Hmm.
totally different structure that I never would have thought about had I not accepted a neurodiversity, my own neurodivergence, and learned from my son,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
I do.
Because my
Yeah.
work history was in a very hierarchical corporate environment in Washington, D.C., so that was my default. But like
Right.
as the CEO, I don't want to continue that
Right.
because it's not as fun for me, right? I want to
Yeah.
work with people. I don't want to be like, I don't know, like trying to control them or coerce them into doing things so that like a
Mhm.
small minority can profit.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's sort of that's really the essence of the shifts that PDAers require us to make, right? Is this
Yeah.
idea that like we can't and shouldn't control people, right? And I think the other thing that comes to mind is like what are the consequences of trying, pushing somebody too far, right? They're experiencing too much stress, they're masking, right? We know that, the mental health overlap of many diagnoses in the neurodivergent space, like autism spectrum, for example, there's like really high rates of, of depression, anxiety, and trauma, et cetera. And so there's real costs here to pushing too hard, right? And it doesn't mean we don't push. This is not equivalent to saying that like there aren't some things that we're still, trying to find the right level of challenge around, to help our kids grow. But the problem is, I think, the societal expectation is that we push kids beyond their limits, right? Rather than kind of knowing what that limit is. And it's such an important
push
issue.
Humans beyond their limits,
Yeah,
to be
exactly.
honest, in
No,
modern
you're right.
society. Like, I really
Yeah.
think we
Yeah.
push people past their limit.
Yeah, I know. Right.
And like,
Hmm.
it does play out, people have mental health issues, addiction, it plays out in their relationships. Like, it's not costless, right? They might show up at the office and execute whatever agenda and like be the professional in that environment, but then it plays out in other places that we don't necessarily see or hear about.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just don't buy into this idea that it's just our kids, or just even the neurodivergent population.
No, you're right. I agree with that. That study I referenced when the Surgeon General, talked about like parenting as a public health crisis. This was not specific to neurodivergence, but it was like I think it was something like 50% of parents reported that they were just like completely overwhelmed and completely stressed by parenting. It's like really high numbers, right? Like we are pushing everybody too far. That is for sure.
Yeah, we just need a little break.
Mm-hmm.
Need a little nap, a little break.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, or a lot of them.
Okay, my number 3. This one ties into ones we've already talked about, but I'll just share it verbatim because it's from my son. He said, it's not behavioral, it's stress. So I think that covers some of the things, the misconceptions we've already said in a different way.
The low arousal approach, have you heard of that? I think Andy McDonald in the UK, the quote that I took from a training I did with them was manage the stress, not the behavior. That was a really good quote. Right. Yeah. Because that helps us, like look beyond the external behavior, but what were the stressors that, led up to that, right? And how can we manage that? Let's not focus on, this external behavior, right? And by focusing on that, we're kind of missing something. So that makes me think of that one. And it kind of also ties into like won't versus can't, right? No, actually, it's not my kid choosing to have a bad behavior, but because of excessive stress, like they can't maybe manage their emotions or something like that. So I love that one.
Yeah, it's a good one. Okay. Number 4. I love your number 4.
So another misconception I see, progress is measured by what we see on the surface. So for example, okay, like we have managed to like make this kid go to school, success. But what if there's huge costs? What if this kid is masking? What if in making them go to school that, without sort of suitable accommodations or changes or an adapted schedule, maybe then we have lost the ability to go to the school the rest of the school year, right? Yeah. So it just kind of ties into like, we can't just think about what's going on the surface, but what is the kid's stress response? Are they, trying to keep it together, and, the sort of Jekyll and Hyde thing we talk about in PD a lot, where like maybe they're presenting, one way at home, right? Like all these challenges maybe, but at school, like school doesn't see anything. Unfortunately, another misconception that links to is then an assumption that like, oh, well, this is just like a home and parenting issue or something, because I don't see any problems at school.
Because the parent isn't consistent, back to number 1.
Right, exactly.
Or number 2.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that this is, like this sort of just gets into, how do we sort of think about well-being and one's internal experience more broadly, rather than sort of like some kind of surface level, like attendance compliance. I'm not against getting to school, right? And like maybe for some kids, that is a measure of well-being, right? To be clear. So like, we need to look at these sort of individually. But again, I think that sometimes it's like, oh, well, on the surface, like, my kid came to the dinner table, every day this week. But actually, we need to be thinking about like, well, is there a cost to that? Maybe not. Great. But maybe there is, right? And just thinking about the fact that they made it to the dinner table is not it, right? Like maybe we push them in a way that is like going to actually make coming to the dinner table more aversive to them in the long run, right? So it's almost like we risk sort of prioritizing short-term compliance over kind of long-term sort of problem solving. So that's what comes to mind with that one.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I used to push, it's funny that you use that example. I used to measure my success as a parent of like, okay, I made my kid, I have 3 meals. I made them sit down and eat the meals, but it would come at the cost of both connection and actually eating.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like if I looked at, and because a pediatrician told me and shared research with me, like your child's eating and like cognitive development will be better if you have family meals. So that's what I was trying to track. But that's when my son's eating got so bad and we were having these knockdown, drag out power struggles and meltdowns. But I kept making him go to the table because I was tracking the wrong form of progress. And we've been undoing that for the last 7 years with his eating, right? And it's now he's finally in a place where he's like experimenting with new foods and feels comfortable eating and trying things. But like, yeah, we had to undo that for years.
Mm-hmm.
And, I didn't know why at the time, but man, not worth it.
Totally.
Not
Right. But that's such a good example that really gets right at the core of this. And it's still kind of commonly encouraged, right? But we need to be really careful when we are using these sort of surface level things as the only marker of progress. So, yep. And that's a really good example.
Nice. Okay. Number 4 for me. Well, this is Cooper. This was a both and one where he said PDAers can't and can hide nervous system stress.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, masking at school, like I could hide it, but sometimes I can't hide it, like at football when I drop the ball. And I know it's not that big of a deal, but my brain and my body like go off or have a big response. And he's like, and I can't hide it from my football team.
I see. Okay.
So yeah, it was just interesting because he was looking at like masking as like you can hide it and then sometimes like you can't, that it will just come out.
Right. And I mean, and that is going to vary, right? From some people like can mask in all situations. Sometimes they, once they hit a certain threshold, right? Like they're not going to be able to anymore. And that could sometimes lead to shame and another kind of avoidance. But yeah, I love how, I think it's really healthy that he's sharing these things. I like that he, he knows himself well here.
Yeah, he does. He does. Okay. I have your number 5.
Yeah. Okay. So my number 5, one of the most common misconceptions I see is the concept that behaviorism will be enough, that is what we need to do. And I think most people know what I mean by behaviorism, I think, but I'm referring to reward consequence systems, that is going to be enough to kind of like fix this issue that we're having. The concepts like sort of ignoring there's sort of problematic assumptions that I talk about a lot in behaviorism, that like a lot of behavioral regulation issues are kind of about attention seeking when really, and then we have that sort of framing, then it's like, oh, well, we just need to ignore this attention, quote unquote, attention seeking behavior, that's going to, kind of extinguish the behavior or something along these lines. And I'd say like, behaviorism, like using rewards or consequences, like maybe that works for some kids, or maybe it works for, even PDAers on a very surface level in a temporary way. But often it actually can quite exacerbate a problem and is really not a robust way to kind of like, it is not a robust solution. Again, it tends to be very kind of surface level. And I think that there maybe are some easier kids that like the threat of not getting something they want is going to be enough to get, what the adults want. But then there's kids that is going to really not work in a really sustained way, even if the parent does it consistently and follows all the advice around these things. And I think that's very common in PD. It's something I hear a lot about, right? Mm-hmm. That like some of these kinds of strategies not only didn't work, but they were kind of harmful, exacerbated a situation, the damage to the trust with my child. And so, I think the misconception really comes down to you can use behaviorist principles with all kids. That is the misconception.
Yeah.
That is, and I really do not see that as true at all.
I completely agree. And I'm going to take it to a more profound level. Let's do it.
No, I love it. I'm all about it.
Okay. Here's the misconception that I had just as a human existing in the world until my son came along was it is possible to control other humans, to fully control other humans. I don't think you can. I think you can. And I think lots of bad people think that they can.
Right.
But like, not bad parents. Like, I'm not talking about parents. I'm just like thinking about like on the global scale. I think we have a lot of systems of control. Yes. But, if we think about Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, and I completely agree with this, like you always have a choice with how you respond. And like when we're trying to control another human, I think there is always some agency that they still have. And so ultimately, like, I feel like my son has taught me, like, you can't control another human. You might influence them, mentor them, shape their life, teach, support, coach. But, like, you're not actually in control of another human. They are in control of themselves. And that maybe that's too radical for this podcast.
No, I love it. I'm all about that.
But, like, I really have tried to sit with that realization over the years of like, not just with my son, but also with others in my life of like, relationships, friendships, people I interact with who have different belief systems than me, people who are writing things on my social media that I disagree with, like it's always come back to this, like, I can only control myself, and can I release trying to control another? Like I will only meet you in collaboration.
Right. I use the analogy of like if you have a boat, speeding down a fast moving river, right? The boat being the kid, like maybe the most we could do is like try to gently steer away from running into the rocks on the side. But we are not going to try to push that boat upstream. It is not going to work. It is going to be too exhausting, right? So it's like our control can be limited. Influence, creative ways to try and influence and steer, sure.
But that comes from love.
Of course.
And relationship and connection. Like that's what I found is how much more influence, coaching, teaching I'm able to do when it's from a place of connection and relationship rather than control.
Right.
And I don't think I would have learned that lesson that deeply without having two PDA sons.
Right. I love that. Yeah, I think of relationship as sort of the opposite of control or the opposite of dysregulation, is the quality of the relationship.
Yeah. Okay, I have my last misconception. This was a joint effort by William and Cooper. Their number 5 is the following misconception. Potatoes are green and they smell like poop. Okay, so this was the point in the conversation where I was like, we need to get 5. And of course, what happens with the PDA? They're like,
pressure's on.
Nope.
Demand.
Nope. And so they did their funny equalizing. And so I wrote it down because I thought it'd be a funny way to end the conversation.
That is a beautiful way to, I love that. Yep. I'm going to give you a 5th, but I'm going to do it in my way. I'm not going to do what you're asking here.
But I'm going to make it my own. And then of course, like my younger son who's 7, who I've been like, oh my gosh, he's learning all his educational skills by not being in school. He jumps on the computer and edits the sentence and like writes out and they smell like poop with perfect spelling. It's just the most PDA moment ever.
I know. I love it. That is beautiful. That's a great way to end it, I think. Yeah, they nailed it.
Very nice. They nailed it. Okay, well, thank you. We have our 10 misconceptions, and I had a lot of fun chatting with you today, Alex.
Me too, as always. Thanks so much for having me on, Casey.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.